joy of working with Kel Simpson, who is now in Korea but used to be a teacher here in our social studies department, as well as Ty Bainter in 3rd grade and Jomari Britta in 1st grade. And we're here to bring you a little bit of the data that we collected in our context for PBL. Our research question was, what is the effect of project-based learning on student motivation and performance? So in true PBL fashion, we defined our problem, and we found that here, a lot of the times teachers are frustrated because their students do not have intrinsic motivation. You can see that sometimes they only care about the grades, they're not super resilient if they get a bad grade or if they fail at something, they just kind of want to move past it, forget that it happened, or general disengagement.
We already knew that best practices were telling us to move away from a teacher-directed approach and focus more on student-led or inquiry-based models. This is largely in part because our world is changing, and so are the jobs that we're preparing our students for. So we wanted to see what would happen if we implemented a PBL model in our classrooms, and if that would show an increase in motivation and performance.
So in our classrooms, we used 1 1st grade classroom, 2 3rd grade classrooms, and 2 8th grade classrooms. As I mentioned, one of those 8th grade classrooms was in Korea with Kel Simpson. Our independent variable that we were manipulating was our teaching methodology. So we used PBL strategies for one unit, and we used traditional methodologies for the other unit. Our dependent variables that we were hoping to affect were student intrinsic motivation and student performance, which was measured with grades. As you can imagine, Colombian culture and Korean culture are very different, so we predicted that we would see changes in the outcome based on age and based on culture. So those were our attribute variables.
Before getting started, we knew we would have to investigate on the research that had already been done about PBL. And the majority of studies confirmed that implementing a PBL showed positive outcomes for both performance and student attitude.
We also know that PBL keeps student misconceptions in their learning to the lowest possible level.
Additionally, implementing a PBL model supports the retention of knowledge and skills attained through the learning experience.
So we knew that there were many benefits to using PBL, but we wanted to find out information in our context on intrinsic motivation. Our research design included using our students as the control group as well as the treatment group. So we implemented a traditional unit where we used teaching strategies such as direct instruction, more independent work, work from some of the chapters in the books, traditional tests and quizzes, and we didn't contextualize the work that we were doing into a real world or challenging problem. Our treatment unit was a PBL unit, and as everyone did the workshops and the essential elements for gold standard PBL, in our master's group, we made sure that our PBL lessons followed all of the gold standard elements. And after each one of those units, we compared grades, which is our measurement for student performance, and we also looked at motivation. And we did this by developing Likert scales. So in our Likert scales, which are like surveys for the students, we were able to gauge how challenged they felt, if the work was personally relevant to them, if they enjoyed coming to class, if they were looking forward to what they were learning, if they could see other people's perspectives, and a lot of other things that result in more intrinsic motivation.
Looking at motivation, our results showed statistically significant increases in all Colombian classrooms, regardless of the age. So that's elementary and the 8th grade class that Britta was working with. The Korean class that Kel was working with also showed an increase in motivation, but it wasn't as evident. This is largely in part because they actually preferred learning from both styles, traditional and the PBL model. Their motivation was high, regardless of what methodology or teaching style was being used.
In our context, though, students were much more highly motivated by PBL methods. And if statistically significant sounds very jargony, what that means is when we did our t-test, so when we compared our data, we could be fairly certain that the thing that was creating increased motivation in the Colombian context was in fact our use of PBL and not a different variable. So here are some of our data representations. The cluster of 4 shows the post-tests on the left side for our control units, and on the right side for our PBL units. And then the one that's off to the side that shows a smaller increase is Kel's classroom.
Looking at our results for performance, which was, as Britta mentioned, measured by student grades, we found that introducing PBL in all elementary classrooms resulted and had statistically significant increases. So that's for the 2 third grade classes and the 1st grade class that we were working with. The 8th grade class from Columbia also showed an increase in performance. However, their results were not statistically significant. And the class from Korea that we were working with actually showed a decrease in performance.
So here are representations and some of the raw data and change. Just to repeat what Kat said, we did see, most importantly in elementary, statistically significant increases in student performance, meaning their grades, as a result of PBL.
The implications of this, given our data, show that teachers with Colombian students, especially at the elementary level, can impact student motivation and performance by following a PBL model. Learning styles and preferences are culturally related, but we actually think that a PBL model works well with our Colombian context because it focuses on real world, and it also plays strongly to their cultural strengths, like their social characteristics and also their strong sense of community.
Although this was based on student data, we also wanted to talk a little bit about the experience for us. So as teachers, using PBL was very enjoyable. When we were implementing the traditional units, we saw the same things that the problem was based around, the disengagement. Students that needed to be told step-by-step instructions, they were just interested in the grade. However, when we started using PBL, we saw changes. So I saw more creativity and ideas with my students. Sometimes they would get annoyed with me for trying to do my mini lesson at the beginning of class because they would arrive and they would know what they needed to do to complete their project. And they were just much more motivated overall, and they were directing themselves as opposed to me needing to tell them what to do every step of the way.
And for me, from an elementary perspective, which typically involves a lot of hand-holding when you're using a traditional style of teaching, it was fantastic to see that my kids were taking ownership over their own learning. They were super proud of the work that they had done, and they really felt like they were making a difference. And to see that in an 8 or a 9-year-old, imagine what we can do. So with that, we want to thank you all so much for letting us share our data with you. And we hope that from this, I mean, if we can do it, that from this you'll take away the motivation to try this yourselves and see what happens.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.